Good morning, everyone who's joining us. I want to ask you a question today. How free are you? We got some folks around the table here at the church, too. It's a big question. How free are you really? We live in a country that we pride ourselves on our freedom. We talk a lot about it. We work for it. We have gone to battle to protect it. Um, We put it on our bumper stickers. Those freedom isn't free bumper stickers that you see going around. We think a lot about freedom in our society. So today I want to invite you to think about that. Yeah, we're coming up on July 4th in just a week or two, week and a half, I think it is. So I want to invite you to reflect. How free are you? The Bible today is going to have something to say about it and some questions to make us think about. So I want to invite you to join me in Proverbs 6, verse 20. I'll read about 15 verses here. I'll read it, and you can join along with me if you want to look in your Bible. If you have any questions or comments, if you're watching on Facebook, please feel free to type those in. Good to see you this morning, Shanna. Hope that you're doing well. Here's Proverbs 6. My child, guard the commands of your father, and do not forsake the instruction of your mother. Bind them on your heart continually. Fasten them around your neck. When you walk about, they will guide you. When you lie down, they will watch over you. When you wake up, they will talk to you. For the commandments are like a lamp, instruction is like a light, and rebukes of discipline are like the road leading to life. By keeping you from the wife of another, from the smooth tongue of the loose woman, do not lust in your heart for her beauty, and do not let her captivate you with her alluring eyes. For on account of a prostitute, one is brought down to a loaf of bread, but the wife of another man's preys on your precious life. Can a man hold fire against his chest without burning his clothes? Can a man walk on hot coals without scorching his feet? So it is with the one who sleeps with his neighbor's wife. No one who touches her will escape punishment. People do not despise a thief when he steals to fulfill his need when he is hungry. Yet if he is caught, he must repay 7 times over. He might even have to give all the wealth of his house. A man who commits adultery with a woman lacks sense. Whoever does it destroys his own life. He will be beaten and despised, and his reproach will not be wiped away. For jealousy kindles a husband's rage, and he will not show mercy when he takes revenge. He will not consider any compensation. He will not be willing, even if you multiply the compensation. Okay, I know the Bible language is sometimes a little difficult to follow, right? Although there's some things that are pretty clear in there. It's talking about adultery and prostitution and some other things. And it's asking some questions that we can answer. Who can hold hot fire against our chest without burning your clothes? Well, that's pretty easy to answer, right? But when you put it all together, what is all this about? So I want to walk you through this. There is a big no-no that the writer of these first few chapters of Proverbs is trying to tell us. A big no-no, a big sin, if you will, big wrongdoing, a big evil. And we might describe that big no-no as unfaithfulness, or desiring things that are out of bounds, that are off limits. So what are those things that are out of bounds or off limits? Well, the writer is going to give us a couple of those at least and make us think a little bit deeper. And so if the big no-no here is unfaithfulness, what is the unfaithfulness about? Well, if you listen, you can clearly tell it's about marriage and adultery and that kind of stuff. But is there something more going on? Usually there is. And we know in Proverbs there's using lots of metaphors because we've been talking about that. So yes, there's going to be something more going on, and we're going to have to look at what that is. The word that I want to throw at you today that this passage is about, I said unfaithfulness, but I really like the word fidelity. You know, like the bank, Fidelity Bank. It's a good word for a bank, right? Because It sort of shows you the strength that you can put your money here and be assured that it's going to stay, because they have fidelity there. That's what fidelity is about. Faithfulness that you can trust, that you're going to always be there, that things are going to be taken care of, that nothing's going to go awry, being truly 100% faithful. I think that's what's at stake here, fidelity. So, second thing that I want to give sort of a disclaimer. This passage, you also heard it center on men, right? Men going after another man's wife. So does that mean that women are off the hook? You can just follow after another woman's husband, and that's okay because only men are the ones being called out here? Is that the way this is working? I would say no. And I would say no because throughout the Bible, we get this mutuality expressed in terms of men and women. I'll give you examples. Genesis. We are made in God's image, both male and female in God's image. Okay, so that you can be assured that if something applies to men, that it also applies to women, because we're both made in God's image. We're going to struggle with the same thing. We're going to have the same difficulties going on in our life. So there's some mutuality that it's expressed. But from Genesis all the way, go to the end of the Bible, towards the end of the Bible, and look at what Paul says. He does the same thing. Paul says, for example, in 1 Corinthians, this is a passage that people love to quote the first part of it, but then they don't ever quote the second half of it. But Paul says, and tell me if you remember this, a wife does not have authority over her body. The husband does. You ever heard that one before?
Yeah.
And the very next part of the verse is, likewise, the husband does not have authority over his body. The wife does. It's funny what people love to quote, right? People love to leave that part out, right? The point is, there is a mutuality being expressed here that between men and women, so that sometimes, yes, the Bible is going to focus on a male, but that doesn't mean it's not intended for a female. Or it's going to say some things about a female, but it's also going to intend a male. It's one of the reasons why we don't look at the story of the fall of creation and point the finger at Eve and say it's all her fault. No, both were created in the image of God. Both did the deed. And so anytime you see a female struggling with something in the Bible, you can be certain that men will also struggle in some similar, perhaps some slightly different ways, because of there are differences between men and women, but there is this mutuality expressed. So no, women are not off the hook. Sorry, women. You gotta look to this one too, just as much as us men. Although maybe the writer chose men because the writer knew that we were going to struggle with this more. I don't know. Maybe that's why he chose to use men instead of women in this particular passage. But nonetheless, we can joke about it a little bit, but both are implied. So, all right, let's start picking this passage apart a little bit. We start with verse 20 to 23. In these verses, you see the word commandment or teaching used a couple times. Guard the commandments of your father. Do not forsake this instruction or the teaching of your mother. Bind them on your heart. Fasten them around your neck. When you walk, they'll guide you. When you lie down, they'll watch over you. When you wake up, they'll talk to you. For the commandments are like a lamp. Instruction is like a light. So you've kind of got those words in there several times. Interestingly enough, the word is Torah. That word for commandment and instructions is a big word in the Bible. In fact, we call those first 5 books of the Bible Torah. That's the word that our brothers and sisters of Jewish faith use for them, because they are commandments, instructions for living. So the word pulls in several meanings. One, yes, it's the laws of Israel. Secondly, it's the laws of God. And thirdly, as in this passage, it can also be used for instructions and laws and commandments in other ways. In here, such as those given to you by your mother and your father. So there's multiple layers of meaning here when we hear commandments, instructions, and all that stuff. Multiple layers of meaning. I'd say all those are present. The laws of the land, the laws of God, and the laws of family. The law, commandments, teachings given to you through your family. So that in some ways, too, part of the point here in these first few verses is to actually connect these instructions, teachings, commandments that are passed down from father and mother to the child, to connect those to God. By using the word Torah, we're supposed to sort of see, okay, so somehow what my mama told me to do is connected to God's commandments for me. Sometimes when we get older, we want to say, yeah, that's good. That's right. Do what I said. But when we're young, we struggle with that and we push back, right? Because we don't always believe that the teachings or commands or instructions of our parents are what we want to do or the best for us. And all of that might actually be at play in this passage. Okay, so let's keep going. Verse 21, this is interesting. The commands, the teachings, the Torah has both this internal and this external dynamic. And you see that in the words heart and neck in this passage. Heart is inside us. So bind these teachings around your heart. That would be another way of saying it would be internalize them, take them into who you are. Secondly, bind them around your neck. In other words, put them on like a necklace. We've talked about some necklace imagery before, and that is an external image, right? So that if you're putting them around your neck, it's not, you can't see what's inside, but you can see what you put on when you put clothes on, when you put jewelry on. Other people can see it. So this external piece is also not only in terms of your actions and what you do in the world, your internal heart, but what you do in the world, but it's also what people can't see within you and what people can see. In other words, these commandments are going to work inside of you, but they're also going to be something that on the outside people see. There's a sort of public, visible component to following the teachings of your parents in this passage, but also of God and of the land. Okay, so that's there. Verse 22. This is interesting. When you read this, you sort of get a little bit of, I think you get a little bit of that Jiminy Cricket, let your conscience be your guide thing going on here. That wisdom is a bit like your ever-present conscience. When you walk about, they'll guide you. When you lie down, they'll watch over you. When you wake up, they'll talk to you. In other words, they're always here. Now, how do I get that from that? Well, let me explain. There's a Hebrew poetic device that's used. We haven't talked about this one before, but it's called a merism. Merism, M-E-R-I-S-M. And a merism is when you take two opposite things and you put them together in order to indicate the totality of something, right? So, for example, if I said from the ocean to the sky, what am I meaning? Everything. That's a merism. So this merism that you get here is interesting because there's three things. When you walk about, when you lie down, and when you wake up, they're with you in every case, guiding you, watching you, and talking with you. So actually, the way that I would describe this is there's actually two separate merisms here. When you walk and when you lie, those are opposites, right? You're either walking or you're lying flat, sort of the vertical and the horizontal, right? And so God is with you both when you're walking and when you're lying down. So there's a merism that gets the totality. The second one, it uses the lie down piece again. When you lie down and when you're lying down, what are you usually doing? You're sleeping. So when you're sleeping and when you wake up, there's your second merism. So the point is when you have these two together with the lie down one being the center one, meaning both literally lying down as opposed to standing up, but also sleeping as opposed to being awake, it sort of heightens the totality. In other words, you can't get away from it. It's always there. These teachings, these commandments are always with you no matter what you do. Now, sometimes, just to give you a little bit of an idea of this, we often find ourselves saying to someone when we've recently lost a loved one, and I know that hits home hard for some of us right now because we've recently lost someone. But one of the things that I find myself often saying is, to my brother and my sister that we're talking with, this person is always with you. Yes, you've lost their physical presence on earth, but they will always be with you in the kind of way that Proverbs is talking about here. Because even though they might be gone from this earth, when you walk about, they'll be in your ear guiding you. When you lie down, they'll be watching over you. When you wake up, they'll be talking to you. Those lessons that we teach. And I'll say that. Think about your mom and dad. I guarantee you, almost all of us, every day, there are multiple things that we do that we do because our mama or our daddy taught them. Whether your mom or daddy is living right now, they are still speaking into your life. This is kind of, I think, some of the idea that's going on here when we hear those commandments from our father and mother that we're talking about in Proverbs. All right, so let's keep moving along. Ask a question on Facebook if you want, or YouTube, or if you've got a question, feel free to throw one in. Verse 23. Now, here's a pretty one because it sounds a lot like Psalm 119. Psalm 119 is that very famous passage. Your word is a lamp unto my feet, your light and a light unto my path. There's a lot of beautiful songs that have been written using that verse. Here in Proverbs, verse 23, for the commandments are like a lamp, instruction is like a light. Very similar to Psalm 119. However, Psalm 119 is very clearly talking about God's commandments, God's laws being a light and a lamp. Here, it's very clearly father and mother's commandments. So again, I'm trying to show you that father and mother's commandments and instructions are kind of linked to God's commandments. And you can see that here through verse 23, something that was in a psalm clearly about God's commandments is now pulled in here to Proverbs to be used about mama and daddy's commandments.
Which they learned from Solomon, the commandments in the Bible, right? I mean, they passed it down from.
Yes, I think that's part of the point. In fact, I sort of hesitated on do we go into looking at this some, because I think some of us look out in the world, and especially those who maybe didn't have the most, well, I'll just say the best parents. They're folks that certainly
parents
had struggles.
Raised with the Bible in their heart.
Are those commandments God's commandments? My Proverbs doesn't really address that, but maybe it actually does right here in this verse. Maybe part of the point is that mom and daddy's commandments can be connected with God's commandments when they come from Scripture. You know,
right?
If they're when you got a mom and daddy who have spent their life in devotion to learning from God in an honest and authentic and vulnerable way. Because I think the other flip side of that is a mom and daddy's commandments like God's commandments just because they went to church their whole life. Well, if they got involved in some of that legalism and those, that kind of stuff, they didn't really get authentic and vulnerable in reading and studying the Bible in terms of letting it question their lives, but they just got very legalistic with it and followed the letter of the law without paying attention to the spirit of the law, then I would say that might be equally as bad as the person who never cracked the Bible open, never even acknowledged the existence of God, right? So I think those are two extremes. But for those people who honestly, picked up the word of God to use it as a light and a lamp for their path and actually sought to follow it, in those vulnerable kind of ways. I mean, that means acknowledging our doubts. That means really questioning the Scripture. It means not just taking it lock, stock, and barrel, but actually taking it apart and putting it back together to try to understand it, right? I think it's that authentic stuff that we can be certain that, those commandments, those instructions from mom and daddy are connected to God's. Regardless, I think part of the point here is that mom and daddy pass stuff down to you. And that stuff is going to be with you. Whether good or bad, it's going to be with you, right? We learn stuff and we take stuff from our families. And even the bad stuff, sometimes it becomes the lamp that we're picking up to guide our path, even if it's a lamp that's not glowing so well and getting us off track, right? So I think there's some of that there too. So maybe this has multiple layers of meaning that can go in a lot of different directions as we think about it. Great observation. And so let's keep pushing on because we haven't even gotten into the adultery stuff yet. So we're going to get that next. Verse 24. Some of your translations might read a different way. I read this: by keeping you from the wife of another, from the smooth tongue of a strange woman. We've talked about the strange woman. Sometimes it's translated loose woman or adulterous woman. And I've said, let's try to stay away from those because that's not necessarily present, because that places the blame upon the woman. And that's actually not what's in the Hebrew. It's simply a woman who's not familiar to you, who you don't know, who's distant from you. Wife of another. Sometimes you'll see that one translated here as evil woman or immoral woman. And again, those connotations aren't here. It's not that there's something bad about this woman. It's simply that she is a woman who is connected and married literally to another person. And so in that sense, she is a stranger to you. She is not your wife. She is a different person's wife. You see the Hebrew here, as it's used in other places in the Bible, it's also translated in these ways, a neighbor's wife. And so why you would take Psalm or Proverbs 6:24 and start saying evil woman when other places in the Bible it's translated a neighbor's wife just doesn't even make sense. It's an interpretation that may or may not be right, and I would say it's not. So the point here is looking at another person's wife and the allure, the desire that another person's wife, or if you're a lady, another person's husband, might pull you towards, right? Commandments are like a lamp, instruction is like a light, and rebukes of discipline are like the road leading to life by keeping you from the wife of another, from the smooth tongue of a strange woman. In other words, your parents' teachings will help keep you from being pulled into the alluring, the desire, the beauty of someone whom you have not committed yourself to.
Keep you from lusting in your heart.
There you go. There you go. Right. So you're now clearly in, what is this passage about? Okay, it's about adultery. It's about lust. It's about being lured in because of your desire for someone else who belongs to someone else. And so what do we make of all that? Well, let's keep reading in verse 25. 25 actually makes this, my translation, wife of another and strange woman, clear as well, because 25 says, do not lust in your heart for her beauty, and do not let her captivate you with her alluring eyes. In other words, this is clearly about someone else out there that you are lusting after. It's not her that's the evil problem. It's actually something in you that's leading you to do something that's wrong or immoral or evil. So let's not make the woman out to be the bad guy through bad translations. And then let's see, verse 26. Well, let me say this. Verse 25 is a little bit of an echo of one of the 10 commandments. I read the translation, do not lust, but a little bit even more accurate of a translation than that would be do not covet. And that sounds a lot like one of the 10 commandments. The word for lust and covet, that's the same word, Hebrew word. Do not covet in your heart for her beauty. Do not covet her with her alluring eyes. That would be a way of trying to, of connecting this. So yeah, it is about coveting. Verse 26, for on account of a prostitute, one is brought down to a loaf of bread. That's a weird saying to us. The Hebrew in this verse is very unclear. We don't know exactly how to translate it, and people have tried to translate it a lot of ways. Some will say on account of a prostitute, you'll be brought to poverty. So the loaf of bread idea is that's all you're going to be left with is a loaf of bread. Out of everything you got, you start getting involved in prostitution, you ain't going to have nothing left but one loaf of bread. In other words, you're going to be poor. In other words, prostitution is costly and damaging. That's the point here. Whatever the Hebrew exactly means, we're pretty certain, we're pretty clear that it's talking about the costly, damaging nature of getting involved in prostitution. We're just not exactly sure how to translate these words, but we're pretty clear that this is the meaning. And then the second half of verse 26, but the wife of another man preys on your precious life. Okay, so prostitution is costly and damaging, but the wife of another man preys on your precious life. So there's a comparison going on here. A comparison between prostitution, which wouldn't necessarily be adultery, right? Because you might get engaged in prostitution without actually cheating on anybody. In other words, if you're single and you engage in prostitution, it's not good, it's wrong, it's immoral, but it's not adultery. So the writer here is comparing prostitution to coveting after another man's wife. And the writer says that that will prey, the adultery piece, preys on your precious life. How does it prey on your precious life? We're going to get that in the next couple verses. 27, 28, 29 gives us some rhetorical questions. They're easy to answer questions, but they make a point. So how does it prey on our life? Well, can a man hold fire against his chest without burning his clothes? What's the answer?
No.
No. Can a man walk on hot coals without scorching his feet? No. So it is with the one who sleeps with his neighbor's wife. So it is. What do you mean? In other words, you take something fiery hot and get it too close and you're going to get set on fire. In other words, there is a consequence to taking this action, right? You can't do this and expect there to be no consequence. There is going to be a consequence. No one who touches her will escape punishment. There's the second half of verse 29. No one who touches another man's wife will escape punishment. There is a consequence for engaging in the act of adultery. And think about that for a minute. So oftentimes in our mind's eye, we think to ourselves, well, if no one found out, what harm would it do? Or we think to ourselves, well, or we even say, it's only illegal if you get caught, right? You've heard people say this before. This sort of ask forgiveness rather than permission thing. We know even when we say that, you're probably going to get caught and you're going to have to ask for forgiveness. The point is that when you do something wrong, statistically speaking, and we've talked about how Proverbs is dealing in statistical probabilities. That's part of the wisdom of Israel, is that if you do this, you will probably have this consequence. Here's that wisdom coming out in terms of this adultery metaphor. If you commit it, you will probably get caught. Don't think you won't. Don't think you won't. Because if you hold a hot fire to your chest, you're going to burn. Right? If you engage in the act, there is going to be a consequence. You will get caught someday at some time. It will enact a consequence upon your life. Don't think you'll get away with it. Does that mean no one gets away with it? There's always exceptions. We talked about that. There's always exceptions to the wisdom of Proverbs, and you can always point to someone who probably did get away with it. But the thing is that we think that I'll be the one to get away with it, and the truth is you won't. Statistically speaking, you won't. People get caught. That's what happens. And even if you don't get caught by a human being, God knows it all. You're going to get caught. You're going to get caught.
Where's forgiveness?
Well, we hadn't got anything about that in Proverbs yet. I want to touch on that. But we haven't got anything about that yet. The point is right now, you haven't done anything. And the writer of Proverbs is encouraging you to think about what will happen if you do it. Don't do it because you will get caught. There will be a consequence. So we're speaking only hypothetically right now, really, in Proverbs. The point of Proverbs wisdom is not to meet you when you have done something wrong and tell you how do you cope with that. No, the point of Proverbs is to teach you what you should and shouldn't do because you haven't yet done it. So let's try to encourage you and show you why you shouldn't do it ahead of time so that you won't do it. Does that make sense? In other words, Proverbs is preventative scripture, not medicinal scripture. Maybe that's the metaphor that we're getting at. Okay, so if you can hold that with me, we'll keep working through. So we're now verse 30. So where are we going to end up over these last 5-6 verses? People do not despise a thief when he steals to fulfill his need when he is hungry. That's verse 30. So now we've pulled in the metaphor of theft, of thievery, of stealing. We had adultery. Now we're into thievery. What's the point here? Well, the point is to look at how adultery is like theft. And so you're going to see a comparison here. If someone, verse 31, if he is caught, we're talking about in verse 30, a thief who steals because he's hungry. So food. If he's caught stealing food, he must repay 7 times over. He might even have to give all the wealth of his house. In other words, you steal material goods, you can pay for it. It might cost you a lot. You might have to even pay more than what you stole, up to 7 times. But you can pay for that theft. It's a material good. It can be replaced, right? If I steal a loaf of bread, I can choose to buy another loaf of bread and give it back, and I have sort of reconciled in some way the theft, restitution, if you will, right, of the theft that I make. Okay, so how does that relate to adultery? Well, verse 32, a man who commits adultery with a woman lacks sense. Whoever does it destroys his own life. He will be beaten, despised. His reproach will not be wiped away. Jealousy kindles the husband's rage, and he will not show mercy when he takes revenge. He will not consider any compensation. He will not be willing, even if you multiply the compensation. Okay, so the point here is you can't pay back what you steal when you commit adultery. So I think we all would understand essentially what that's talking about. So the comparison here from thievery is that there's material theft, which you can replace, and there is adulterous theft, or if you will, sexual theft. You cannot replace what is stolen in sexual theft. There's no way to give back what you've taken in that way.
Can't undo it.
You can't undo it. You can't pay someone. You cannot compensate them. And even if you were to say, I'll compensate you 7 times. And you know what 7 times is? That's the number of completeness. In other words, I will fully, completely compensate you 7 times. And the verse says, won't even accept that kind of compensation, because that cannot replace what you've stolen when it's a sexual theft.
Well, what are you saying? You're going to let him have his wife 7 times?
Even that doesn't work, right? Yeah, right. It's already his wife, the other man's. You can't replace it. You can't give back what you've taken in that kind of wrongdoing. So to go back to your question, Roby, where does that leave forgiveness? Well, it leaves us with a damning consequence of infidelity, right? Enough to scare us into being faithful. And maybe that's the point of Proverbs, with the child, is to sort of scare them into not taking the wrong action. I don't know. I don't like those tactics myself. I don't think the Bible is full of them. I think we human beings love scare tactics, right? We talked just a couple weeks ago in Sunday service about how some Christians just love to scare you out of hell and into heaven. And so people will come to Christianity, convert, become saved, only to avoid hell, as if that's the point of Christianity. Talked about before, hell insurance, right? I just want to get to heaven, so I'll do the ABC prayer just so I can get to heaven. And once I'm good, I don't have to do anything else. I might even show up at church every Sunday, but I'm showing up because I just don't want to go to hell. That is not faith, friends. That is not belief. That is not following Jesus. So I don't think the scare tactics are great. Yet, maybe that is what's happening here in Proverbs in terms of adultery. So my question is, but is there more? Is there more going on here? Is it simply about scaring us out of something or into something else? And I do think that there's more. And that's why I asked everyone at the beginning, how free are you really? Therein lies where I think that this passage is trying to say something to us. Being totally free in our minds today as U.S. Americans typically means being able to do what you want to do. Whether it's own this or own that, whether it's do this or do that. If I'm free, I can do what I want. No one can really tell me what to do or what not to do. That's the way that we often think of freedom. And I want to submit to you that Proverbs here and many other places in the Bible are asking you to think deeper about what freedom really is. We would think that freedom in terms of another man's wife would mean, well, if I'm free to do what I want, then I'm free to to take. I'm free to engage in that relationship with another man's wife. You can't tell me not to. And in this country, technically you are. Now, there might be consequences, but you're free to do it. We don't actually have laws against adultery. We may have consequences that a spouse can engage in against her husband or vice versa if they engage in adultery. But it happens all the time. Adultery happens all the time. And it's not like if you get caught in it, you're going to jail. It's not illegal. So, yeah, you're free to do that in this country. Proverbs makes us think more about what that kind of act is. It is a theft which cannot be repaid. So I'm free to engage in a theft which I can never repay. I said to you the issue, I think, in Proverbs is fidelity. And fidelity or faithfulness invites us to think about what it means to be free and what it means to limit our freedom. In terms of the metaphors of adultery and theft going on here, I think Proverbs is inviting us to think about our desires, our wants, our decisions in terms of being faithful and in terms of being unfaithful. So we are bound by many things. We talked about at the beginning of Proverbs. It tells us that we're bound by what our parents have taught us. That voice is always going to be speaking in our heads throughout the rest of our life. We are bound by our commitments. That's why the marriage metaphor is used here in Proverbs. When you engage in marriage, you make a vow, a commitment, a decision to be faithful to someone. And there are many other decisions in your life that you are bound by. You made them. They're a responsibility that you agreed to. You're also bound by the laws of a land. That's why the passage started out with the words Torah. Torah meaning both the commands your parents gave you, but also the commands of the land of Israel that we get in the first 5 books of the Bible, which are also the commands of God. So Torah having all 3 of those meanings. In other words, you are bound by the instructions, the teachings of your parents. You are bound by the laws of your land. You are bound by the commandments, the instructions, the teachings of God. On all those levels, we are, there is something placed upon us. The point is that individual freedom does have what seems to be limits. We're limited by what God is teaching us. We're limited by the laws of our land, and we're limited in a lot of ways by what our parents have taught us and passed on to us. When you look at this and you think about the way that desire and want play into this, if you're doing something because you desire it, is that simply freedom to do it? Or are you actually being controlled by your desire? The point here, I think Proverbs, and particularly in using the metaphor of adultery, which is about that intense, lustful desire. There may not be a stronger desire than when it comes to lust. Are you really free when you chase after that want, that desire? Or are you being controlled by something that Paul would call flesh? Are you really being controlled by something that is within you that is not necessarily of God? Even though you think you're free to own this, to take this, to do whatever you want to, perhaps, Proverb invites us to think, you are being controlled by some things that you're not even aware of. Controlled by selfishness, controlled by greed, controlled by lust, controlled by anger, controlled by a great number of things that exist within you, which is maybe why that first part of this section talked about putting the commands on your heart internally and around your neck externally. And that when we think about these desires and how desires control us, then maybe these teachings from God, from the laws of our land, and the teachings from our parents are really boundaries in our lives that, though they seem to limit individual freedom, they are really about leading us to greater freedom. That sounds contradictory. It sounds counterintuitive. A limit leads us to greater freedom. A boundary, a law that seems to be limiting our freedom to do whatever we want to, is really about leading us to greater freedom. Well, if the boundary is putting your desire in a container and helping you to limit your desire, then isn't that boundary actually getting you away from control of your desire and leading you into a greater freedom? That's a question that I think Proverbs here is begging us to ask. Dietrich Bonhoeffer says it this way in a poem that he wrote. I'll read it. Self-discipline. If you set out to seek freedom, you must learn before all things mastery over sense and soul, lest your wayward desiring, lest your undisciplined members lead you now this way and that way. Chaste your mind and body, and subject to you and obedient, serving solely to seek their appointed goal and objective. None learns the secret of freedom save only by way of control. It is a seemingly contradictory statement. None learns the secret of freedom save only by way of control. The point is, if you don't find a way to limit and control your desire, your lust, your greed, your anger, these vices that many have named, for example, as the 7 deadly sins, if you don't find a way to control those, they will control you. And though you will think that you're out there exercising your freedom, you are actually being controlled by things that are wrong, bad, evil, and they will control you and your life and lead you down a path that is not lit by the Word of God.
Let's see, alcoholism, drugs, and everything else that lets your control
Takes your freedom.
takes your freedom away. I mean, you fall into these sins because you lack control once you get to that drunken state.
And it controls you.
You'll find at the end of that rope how controlled you are by that substance, right? Addiction is a great, great metaphor for it. You may do it thinking, oh, this can't hurt me. Oh, I'm just doing this because I just want to relax. Oh, I'm in control. And every addict has gotten to a point where they've realized, I am not in control of this. At the end of the rope, at the end of the day, when you're strung out so bad that your life is threatened, you start to realize, wow, I thought I was free to do this. The truth is, this has every bit of control over me.
And on the other side of that, Bonhoeffer was basically the Germans think they got me in prison, but I'm free.
He has something radical to say about this. Yes. Exactly when you are when it may seem to the world that you're imprisoned, Christ sets us free. And that's kind of where I want to end. Part of the wisdom of God is fidelity. That is self-control, limiting desire, holding to our promises and our commitments, clinging to those lessons passed down from family, from God, and following in the way of God through Christ. Though all of those things would seem to put limits to your ability to do what you want to do, they are actually about helping you control desire, lust, greed, anger that is within you so that you can be free. But we're talking about God's freedom. We're not talking about your individual freedom. We're talking about true freedom that is of God, that only God can engage in the way that Paul talks about it. Christ has set you free for freedom, not for your individual freedom to do whatever the heck you want to do, but for God's freedom. I think that's the word that I sort of wish Paul had put in there. I think that's what he means. He just didn't add the adjective. Christ has set you free for God's freedom. That sort of helps us not misuse that verse in Paul's letters. And the best, if you think about it, at the end of the day, the best metaphor to get this idea across is adultery. It really is, because adultery, it is an intense desire. It is a kind of theft that you can't repay, so that there's nothing there's no way out of the metaphor of adultery when it comes to thinking about our wants, our desires, and our freedom. There's no way to wiggle your way out of it. You can't say, oh, well, yes, it might capture me, but I can always fix it. I can always repay it. Nope, you can't. And that is how controlled you are by things like greed, lust, selfishness, desire, anger, and so on. You're controlled in a way that you can't repay it. There's nothing you can do. So look, there are limits that are good and healthy for us. Those are going to come in a variety of ways. So when someone else sets a limit upon us, family, God, even government, yes, I hate to say it, but that's where it is. It's Israel, Torah in Israel. It was the law of their land, just like we have laws of our land. Our first goal ought not to be to say, well, you're limiting my freedom. Mom, Dad, God, government. Our first goal ought to be to do what Proverbs is inviting us to do, and to consider how this teaching, commandment, law, whatever, this Torah that's being set upon us, is about helping us control our desires, our lust, our greed, our anger, all of that negative stuff in us that actually might be controlling us. And maybe if we did that as a society, we would find a whole lot more morality and ethical living and holy living and God-centered lifestyles, a whole lot more ability to follow Christ in the way that Christ lives on earth as he does in heaven. All right, I'm going to end us there. I went far too long today. I'm sorry. For folks online, thank you for bearing with us throughout this noontime Bible study. There was a lot. I mean, we covered 15 verses. We don't usually cover that much, but they all did really fit together. I hope that you will take this with you as you engage upon this July 4th and we celebrate our independence. We, at the same time as Christians, while we celebrate our independence as a country, we also celebrate our full dependence on God. So I invite you to remember that during this holiday that'll be coming up in just a week and a half. And throw your questions out to us. We'd love to engage you more if you want to throw a question or comment on Facebook or YouTube or send one in through email. I also want to invite everyone right now, if you've got a prayer request on your heart, you can text the word pray to our church phone number. That's 910-892-2711. And we will ask you what we can pray for you today. You can just respond to those text prompts, and we will hold on to your prayer and lift you in prayer throughout the rest of this week. Text pray to 910-892-2711. If you'd like to, you can join us on our prayer call line right now, 563-999-1222. And we will spend about the next 10 or 15 minutes in a time of prayer and sharing concerns together. So join us there. Again, 563-999-1222. Have a great